Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to be discussing the anatomy of the nephron. So we mentioned previously that the nephron is the basic functional unit of the kidney, and so we're going to draw this crazy structure, and it's going to look like probably one of the weirdest things you've ever seen. But essentially what it comes down to is the structure is responsible for filtering the blood, eliminating waste products and things that we don't want in the blood, and then making sure that the good stuff like nutrients and water and ions don't accidentally get eliminated from the body. We really want to make sure that we get to save them. So we're going to just sort of draw in some cells. So you want to kind of think of this as the black outline is the tube, and that's all it is. It's just a tube. And initially we're going to have this catch basin, and then we're going to sort of, it's almost like a funnel. We're going to funnel everything into a tube, and then the tube, when we get to the very, very end, is going to dump into the renal pelvis. And then the red is our vasculature. So the vasculature is very interesting here, and we want to be able to talk very specifically about what all these things are. What I'd like to do is first label the blood supply. So from the renal artery, there are a series of branches that ultimately the artery is going to break into a bunch of different smaller vessels, and the very last one that it breaks into before it becomes capillary is the Afferent Arteriole. So we're going to kind of skip over those other blood vessels. We're not going to be talking about their role or their significance. So just kind of know that from the renal artery, we're going to break into a bunch of vessels, and ultimately we're going to take one Afferent Arteriole and we're going to feed it to the nephron. All right, so think of, as I mentioned, think of the area that's shaded in blue as kind of like a funnel, and we're almost going to take the Afferent Arteriole, and then as it branches into these capillaries, it's going to sort of sit nicely inside of the funnel. And the capillaries are called the glomerulus. So glomerulus is just the fancy name for capillary in the kidney. It's kind of like shaped like a little ball, I guess, of capillaries. And one critical point about these capillaries is they are fenestrated. So we've discussed the different types of capillaries that exist, and the different types of capillaries have different degrees of security in terms of the fact that the blood is flowing through them and isn't going to leak out. So fenestrated capillaries are capillaries that have pores in them on purpose, because we do want some stuff to leak out. So we're trying to make it easy for the stuff we want to get rid of to leave. So the Afferent Arteriole breaks into the glomerulus, and then eventually those capillaries will merge back together, and they will enter into the Efferent Arteriole. So think of the Efferent Arteriole. This is kind of interesting. This is our final example of a portal system, and a little different than the portal vein systems that we've discussed before. But so this is an arteriole that's functioning as the portal vessel. But the Efferent Arteriole is going to take the blood from the glomerulus and then feed it to the peritubular capillaries. So we have essentially an arteriole, and then a capillary network, and then another arteriole, and then another capillary network. So I tried to draw it behind, but the peritubular capillaries, think of them as in very close proximity to the actual nephron structures. And then there's also a component of vasculature that is capillary in nature that will extend around the loop of Henle, and that is called the vas erecta. So it's not really technically behind, I just drew it behind to make it easier for the drawing, but it would appropriately probably wrap around the loop of Henle. All right, so now let's talk about the different structures of the nephron itself. So the vasculature is not nephron, it's just what feeds the nephron. Now the nephron will start again with the blue structure, which is called Bowman's capsule. So Bowman's capsule is made of essentially two layers. The funnel is two layers, and there's a fluid space in between. So the layer that sits up against the capillary, the glomerulus, is the visceral layer, and the outer layer is called the parietal layer. And we're going to actually, this is going to be one section all by itself, Bowman's capsule. So we'll have the opportunity to draw those cells again and talk about some specifics about their their structure. Now, the funnel is going to feed into the renal tubule, and the renal tubule is broken down into a couple of different components. So the first component is the proximal convoluted tubule. So proximal meaning closest to Bowman's capsule and closest to the glomerulus, and convoluted because it's all twisted and there are lots of turns and almost like a crazy water slide, I guess. And then tubule because it's part of the renal tubules. That will feed into the loop of Henle. So the loop of Henle is shaded in purple, and we actually have several components of the loop of Henle. The left side is the descending limb of the loop of Henle, and then the right side we have the ascending thin limb and then the ascending thick limb. And we'll talk about the differences between what happens at each of those sites, again in a separate section. And then lastly, we have the distal convoluted tubule, so the distal meaning furthest from the glomerulus, convoluted of course because it's all twisted like a water slide, and then tubule because it's part of the renal tubule. It's all right to say PCT and DCT without writing out the entire explanation, but as in all the other cases, it's important to get the letters of the abbreviation exactly right. And then lastly, the distal convoluted tubule will dump its contents into the collecting duct, and the collecting duct actually can merge several distal convoluted tubules, can actually dump into the same collecting duct. You can see that it branches, and then from there, the collecting duct we said will empty into. It actually empties into the papillary duct, and then it will empty into the renal pelvis. All right, so without discussing the specifics of the physiology, I hope that you can at least sort of see this as just a path of travel for fluid inside of the tube that is hollow. And then all the cells that are around it have special jobs that we're going to talk about in a separate video. And one last point that's interesting about the fluid that's in the tube is we actually change the name of the fluid as it progresses through its passage. So when the fluid empties from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule, so from the glomerulus, in the glomerulus we would call it blood, and then not everything is going to move from the blood into Bowman's capsule. So what's in Bowman's capsule we call filtrate, and then once it enters into the renal tubule we call it tubular fluid, and then finally when we get to the very end of the collecting duct and we're emptying the collecting duct we call it urine. All right, and the last thing I want to do is just spend a couple of minutes talking about the Juxtaglomerular Complex. And so one critical point about this drawing, I guess maybe a limitation again of not being able to do it in 3D, is that technically speaking, even though we've drawn it sort of in as if there's a linear progression of the fluid, what actually exists in real life is the distal convoluted tubule is actually very close to, so sort of like where I've drawn the arrow for the ascending thick limb, and then it merges with the distal convoluted tubule, is actually right next to the afferent arteriole. So think of it actually as folded up. That would be the normal baseline. And so we have a couple of cell structures that have some other functions in the regulatory capacity. So for example, monitoring contents of fluid, things like chemical concentration and secretion of certain regulatory particles. So that's also gonna be sort of a separate. We're gonna we'll do that in a different video. But I just want to point out that we have the Afferent Arteriole, and there are certain cells of the Afferent Arteriole that have a certain regulatory role, and then they line up next to these green cells, which are actually called mesangial cells, which again I'll spell out in a different video. And then that sits up against the ascending thick limb of the loop of Henle, and so the interaction between them is actually very critical to the regulatory function of the nephron. All right, that concludes our overview of the nephron, and in the next video we're going to start talking about some of the different processes that occur in order for urine to be produced and eliminated. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.